Okay, so we have in the studio Noam Cohen, who was a writer and editor and media columnist, or technology columnist at the New York Times, and now he has a book out called The Know-It-Alls: The Rise of Silicon Valley as a Political Powerhouse and Social Wrecking Ball. So, Noam, let's talk about this book.
Well, it was hard to make everything rhyme like that. I mean, technology is a big word, and I don't know how to rhyme it, but I wanted to do it. I mean, it's what I...
Right. Now, is this thing out already? It's on the market?
No, it's coming out in November, and I remember Maliki had a lot of good advice about books and promotion, and his advice was to say the name over and over again. So The Know-It-Alls is going to be coming out
in November. It's a good name, right?
The Know-It-Alls? Yeah, I think it's a great name.
Was there other options? I mean, because we talk about this, we'll talk about the essence of the book.
Sure. No, I think it was a great title. The editor came up with it very early, and it kind of helped drive writing it even.
And who are they?
So Know-It-Alls are what I would call this collection of billionaires or near billionaires in Silicon Valley who have made a lot of money through companies like Google and Facebook and PayPal and LinkedIn, and you can,
So Zuckerberg,
and a guy named Andreessen, Reid Hoffman, Sergey Brin, and Larry Page, who've made a lot of money through these tech companies, and they've kind of used computers to understand people, manipulate people, and sort of see that model as something can be applied to the way our society is organized. So they will want to, someone like Zuckerberg will want to affect education, or the people from Google will try to affect education and see what works online and say, hey, we should have education be online and personalized. Or we'll say that, gee, everyone's an individual online. Isn't that great? Everyone can say what they want, so we should treat everyone like an individual in the world, in our country, and not really have social obligations, or not really favor having, strong public schools and labor unions, things that hold us together as society. I see them as pushing a libertarian idea of everyone out for themselves.
Right, so where the internet becomes this, well, it's a meritocracy because everyone can get online, even a homeless guy, or even the poorest of the poor, or the least privileged of us can go into a library or go into these kiosks you see on whatever it is. I mean, everyone, now we're in an age where even homeless people have iPhones. And
I think that is part of it.
But is it really true? Like, once you have this forum online, does that kind of even the playing field?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that basically I think a lot of what they think is that history has ended now, that basically is a new world. There was like this kind of document called the Declaration of Cyber Independence written in the 90s, and it kind of said, like, now with this world, everyone has access to the internet, and there is no race, there is no gender, there is no history. It's a new world. It's like that kind of utopianism that is kind of scary, because basically there is still history, and there are still homeless people, and it's not the same to be online as to have a house. And so that's exactly the kind of conflating or the mixing of the virtual world and the real world. And
and life is not fully lived online. I mean, it's only one. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned, like, they're moving different aspects of our lives onto online. You can go to school online. You can work from home. So much of our lives rely on the technology
and politics. And that's really interesting. What's something that just happened that's kind of very apt for what the Know-It-All is about is this movement. The guy who created Zynga, which is like Farmville, that weird online game, and so his name is Pincus, and then somebody named Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn. They have this idea, which they call WTF, for, not what you think, but for win the future. And they kind of have this idea, again, that that politics should just be online, and we should use Twitter to say what we want to care about and then vote that way. And they think that that's better than kind of the way society's set up offline. And that the Know-It-Alls part is trying to say that there's very little humility. It's not this idea of saying, I understand well how to get people to create a social network, but I don't really know anything about how to organize work. But instead it's like, hey, we should take the idea there and the disruption that we cause, and it's great. It'll make everything better. And it's that arrogance is what the Know-It-Alls is trying to capture.
Well, when you talk about politics moving online, I mean, there is this notion about, I wonder how much, in this election where Trump got elected, with fake news and all this stuff where stories were, and, even Facebook and Twitter, we're bearers of stories that were inaccurate, and they were written, purposely, and that kind of thing. So, like, who bears responsibility for all that stuff?
I think it kind of relates to our background at working at the New York Times. And, when I hear Porky talking about the Transit Authority losing all these workers from the 80s, who I think he was kind of saying that these are people with long experience, 30 years of knowledge, and they just all go at the same time. New York Times,
journalism is
a similar kind of thing, where there's been this move to get rid of people, and have younger people in. So I think what we're losing are the cliches, say gatekeepers. And I'm not advocating like limiting people's freedoms or access to all these tools. It's just the idea that, if you don't believe there are such a thing as journalism, objective journalism, people who kind of take an oath or pledge to do their best to tell what's going on in the world, then there is no distinction between a Russian bot promoting something or respected journalists. It's kind of this diminishing of any kind of authority or any kind of social, there's a history. Partly, I guess, when I was thinking about what the book's about, it's this idea that they are very eager to destroy things and don't realize what they're destroying, how valuable it is. I mean, I think about, it's kind of a weird analogy, but back to sports, that like there was a pickup basketball game at my Y, and like it was very hard it took like 20 years to build this game up. Everyone knew to come. I'm sure there are equivalent things of, quilting bees or whatever it is. And if someone kind of just reschedules and it disappears, it's so hard to build it back up. So I think kind of what's going on is that they are destroying things like newspapers or labor unions or libraries or public schools. These things have been, hundreds of years of our history have been to like make them work, and then they're replacing them with things that are very not so effective, like fake news. Like the news system that I think even Facebook and Twitter would agree, the news system they have provided in place of this is very weak, and Google as well. It is manipulable, it's not reliable, it's not well sourced, it's not well written, all these. So what they're replacing with is much worse than what we had.
Right. Now, does a lot of this come back to like kind of an ethos that these people started with, where it's like, well, it's up to you to decide. I mean, this is all like fend for yourself kind of ideology, right? Like,
I think it's kind of that. It's the libertarianism, and also it's kind of when the know-it-alls. Again, why I think that title is so good is that, and like I said, my editor came up with it, is that it both captures the idea that they believe because they are good at computers that they understand the world, and that's really a very interesting thought. They sort of think, look, I can, and what was really, there were a lot of interesting quotes that I sort of found from the book. There was a writer who kind of criticized, he identified the computer obsessive, what he called the computer bum, back in the 70s, and he talked about why are these young people, he was like an MIT professor, he was like, why are these young people so fascinated at like sit at a computer and sleep there and drink Coke, and like the cliche that we now think of Mark Zuckerberg with like the hoodie, and like, but he was looking at the 70s. He was like, clearly, no, they never before could you have like such control over a world. Like on your computer screen, you can make up, down. He was saying you can make a world. It's just, you are like
self-contained. Yeah.
Self-contained, exactly. It's called closed worlds, exactly. And so I think the idea is that was okay. So it was weird. The hackers are kind of weird. They had a closed world on screen, but like someone like Zuckerberg is leaping from a closed world of being a hacker, which he was, like as an 11-year-old making these games. He made a game of like Julius Caesar. I think he was fascinated by the power of a computer, and now he's trying to apply it to the world. And it's like, that's the scary leap, that bridge between computer world and real world. So I feel like no one's really focusing on this. Like it's kind of happening without anyone's, because it kind of happens naturally. There's been no questioning of it. It's like Facebook keeps growing. They're very, like if there's any kind of competitor, they buy them out. If there ever is a kind of another rival social network, they're willing to spend incredible amounts of money to buy them out so they can keep growing. The only exception has been the Snapchat, is the only kind of potential rival. But Facebook bought out WhatsApp, bought out Instagram. Anything they can see that is a rival, they'll buy out.
Right. So it's not as much. Well, it's partly to gain their property and to gain whatever the benefit they can from their company, but it's also to get them out of the picture, right? To buy out the competition.
I think
a
real interesting thing
right?
is, it's like the network effect, which basically that something like Facebook is so big that you can't not be on it. Like I personally am not on it, but I missed the death of a friend's mother. I mean, you are like, it's like it's weird to not be on Facebook. I mean, it's just weird.
Well, is it for ideological reasons that you're not on
it?
Yeah,
I think I don't really like. Yeah, I don't like it. Yeah,
it's adding another dimension of. I mean, I'm not busy on it either because I don't want to add another level of busybodiness in my life. And I have 17 people this morning that I have to kind of get back to, or else they're wondering why I don't get back to them and all this other stuff. It's just life is complicated enough, right?
I can say I never. It's like closing your door off. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I think it's part of it. Yeah, it's part of practical, but part. I guess I don't really believe in it particularly.
But it's not to do with like you wrote the book and you know how it really works, and you want to kind of this is a personal protest.
It's a little bit like that. Is that weird? A little bit like that. I feel like Amazon is a real test for that as well. Like my wife really loves Amazon, and I feel like Amazon. I like to shop in a store. I think it's Amazon clearly is trying to take over. It's interesting. When I went back in this book, I looked at a lot of the history of how these things. I was trying to like just walk back and say, how did we get where we were? Like it wasn't like this. Obviously, the web was created, let's say 25 years ago. Amazon was this very interesting idea where like he was a banker, right? He was a banker, and he had this idea: I want to be the middleman for all commerce. How do I do
This
that?
is Jeff Bezos?
Jeff Bezos. So he started with books. He's like, books are very, like, every book's the same. People are very loyal about books. No bookstore has every book. Everyone's ordering books back anyway. I mean, it's not weird to say, like, I can get you any book you want. I don't have it right now, but I'll go order it. And then people were used to that. But he knew that books were just going to be a beachhead to take over all commerce. And, like, he had a strategy. Like, it doesn't happen by accident. All these things are kind of happen by a plan. And same thing with, Google and Facebook. Maybe they started out a little more idealistically, but eventually they got kind of channeled into the Silicon Valley venture capital world. So I was trying to just sort of look back and see where their choices could things have gone differently,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder about some of these things, like how, when you did your reporting and writing of this thing, I mean, you're kind of, I won't say taking on, because I don't know, you're not taking these people down. You're trying to write you're giving it as, objective take as you can on it. But some of these people are, litigious. Peter, like Thiel,
Peter
has
Thiel's
sued people who has gone up against him.
Sure.
Were you worried about anything about taking on people
what am I
like
supposed
this?
to say about that?
People?
I don't know. I mean, I do wonder. I think everyone tells me that, what they call punching up, that I should be honored if they were to get upset at the book, and that would give it attention. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I was scheduled through the publisher to go speak at Google, and I feel like that's kind of like going to Lion's Den a bit, because I do think I look at Google and how it had this kind of path that was non-commercial and idealistic by these two founders whose parents were professors, and they came in and they actually wrote this paper about why search had to be non-commercial, no ads, because it was too manipulable if you had ads. And they had this very idealistic vision, and over time they got shunted to become a company. And I think there's a great story. I didn't discover this story about how they were discussing how to they were at Stanford's computers and was kind of breaking the Stanford system or taxing it. And they said, what should we do? And they went to a professor, and the professor got them to meet someone who gave them $100,000 check that day. And they're like, we're not a company yet. He's like, just take it, you'll use it someday. And they were kind of led into this world. So I feel like I'm trying to just sort of lay out how it happened. And I hope they appreciate. I think they should want their history told. I feel in some ways there is this sense they want to kind of just make everything kind of inevitable and not make it seem like a choice. Yeah. So I mean, and I hope they'll be received that way. And I think in some ways there's been a lot of absence, of historical looking at this time. It's almost like too recent.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, and again, this is we're talking about Noam Cohen's book, The Know-It-Alls. We're talking with Noam Cohen, and this is The Know-It-Alls: The Rise of Silicon Valley as a Political Powerhouse and Social Wrecking Ball, the New Press. And
coming out in November.
Yeah, right. And so Noam's going to stay with us here in the studio. We're going to go to a musical interlude, and we're going to come back and speak to another New York Times colleague of mine from the old days. He's still there. He's writing about weddings now, and we're going to ask him how he got to write about weddings for the Times. His name is Vinny Malazzi, so we'll be back in a minute or two with him.